Animosity Advent Stories. Something in the water. Governor Amos Hatfield clutched his cloak tight about his shoulders. The shyish underworld of Lake Baikal was a frozen hellscape at the best of times, but the newly opened realm gate to Garan had thawed the place, and the Everqueen's subsequent right of life made it almost livable. Not anymore, it seemed, and suddenly Amos understood why his predecessor, Gustav Johann Schmidt, had so quickly abandoned the governorship after all these years. The steep mountain path finally gave way, and Amos's entourage saw the summit before them. Yannick's Observatory, they called it, named after the crazy old coot who lived there. Amos, only just arrived the week before, hadn't yet made time to visit him, but the wizard's messenger pigeons were insistent, coming hour after hour, summoning him at once. Yannick, all grey goatee, glinting spectacles, and bundled furs, did not stand on ceremony before his new governor, and instead practically dragged the reluctant man up to the top of the tower. It had been built above the tributary where the River flowed into Lake Baikal, and one could see all the lake from here. Amos, attempting to make sense of the wizard's overwrought explanations, noted with unease that the tower's great telescopic apparatus was not pointed at the Gear Plunge realm gate, as it normally would be, but toward the lake. "This is what I'm telling you," Yannick insisted. "I can no longer see the cult of Cain's citadel, nor anything else to the sound. There is something in the way, something ponderous, gargantuan." Amos's stomach tightened at the words. He'd read Schmidt's reports of the great evil that was entombed here. "Snow and ice blind my looking glasses, but I'm telling you, there is something there." When last war came to Lake Baikal, the vermin lord they called Technofire had adopted the name Oracle of Enlightenment. His body was riddled with warpstone and aether quartz, giving him a unique perspective on things. Where once bickering clans and tribes of Skaven and beastmen had infested this underworld, there was now only the cult of enlightenment, all sharing one mind with their master. Nestled deep below the mountains, it was through the eyes of his follower thralls that the oracle beheld the coming upheaval. At first, the vermin lord feared the impossibly vast and rotting husk buried beneath Baikal had resurfaced, and the malignancy it bore with it, but the scopes of his Giselles soon put that theory to rest. It was made of earth and stone and ice, rising out of the lake's waters without ever disturbing the surface. His prized arch-warlock took arcane readings from his hissing, sparking devices, while careening doom-flayers raced across freshly forming ice to investigate. Deep within the fog, the vermin lord's countless ears could just make out the mournful stroke of a single hammer against an anvil, its irregular beat not unlike a dying heart. Helindra Fayscorn's face was a bitter scowl. Mind you, it often was, save during the rare delight of an undeserving murder. But today was worse than usual, and even her witch elves avoided her glare, to say nothing of the shivering, miserable wretches shackled to the blade-like galley's oars. This underworld was rightfully hers. Hammerhall itself had ceded their claim to Marathi Kane's people. Still, they were neither Osiarch, nor Nighthaunt, nor Chaos Demon. They required food to eat, and with the natives' Declaration of Independence, resupply would come only through the Sigmarite-held Gear Plunge realm gate. Which was why she now embarked to visit her newly arrived counterpart in Fort Gavustaman. Not to flay him living and bathe in his blood, but to negotiate trade agreements. She clenched her fists before forcing herself to relax, a nearby subordinate delicately moving further away at the gesture. She was almost relieved when a shout went up from the bow. She raced forward, but found the sentry stupefied, the woman's mouth agape. Halindra's eyes searched the mist before realizing the impossibility of what lay before them. The lake bore no islands, yet she saw great columns of ice and rock, and beyond them ruined battlements and cast-down hovels. It stretched as far as she could see to the starboard and the port, utterly blocking their passage. Halindra's scowl split into a wild grin. It appeared she would have more to speak about with the governor than just stale rations. The mayor of Bolyani, Gertrude Brown, and her son, Garrett Brown, sat in respectful silence, mugs of turnip broth held tightly between cold hands. The lake's new arrival was the talk of the town, and in that confusion they had sought the counsel of the most wise among them, Ma Powler, the root elder. She busied herself about her hovel, working at her own pace, chopping and dicing and stowing countless jars of fermenting roots and strings of drying roots all about the place. They knew better than to interrupt her. She would answer them when she was ready. Backhull was an underworld for sailors lost at sea. She spoke at length, her voice cracked and grating, but not unkind. But no longer. Things have changed since I was young. She laughed. This place, our home, it is a low spot in the River. Our realm is the end of all things, and all things which have found their end on the River will now find their way here. But this is no lost soul, Ma Powler, Garrett interrupted, and his mother shot the hot-headed youth a withering glance. He shrank back as though struck. Ma Powler laughed again. All things die, even things that cannot know death. She peered at him, suddenly piercingly, and he squirmed further. In the way that you do, no. She turned back and rummaged through a pot for a stick of charcoal. All things die, but death is not the end. Not in Shyish. That's the way of our realm, of our home. And children should learn as much. She scratched a single word into a bit of cloth with the charcoal as she spoke, and set it before the Browns. Stumbling over the pronunciation, Gertrude was the first to speak it aloud. For home, she breathed. A dream reforged. Lord Celestin Balion's storm mantle pulled at the fur cloak about his shoulders to stave off the morning's chill. It had been an early winter, and the situation had not been helped by the frost coming from the Gear Plunge realm gate. Balion ruminated as he walked through the empty streets that had once been Amasya. The once broken city had been given new life, as the Knights of the Fulgurite Order Stormhost took stewardship and rebranded it as Pilgrim's Hollow. By his side was Swaz, his trusted grot companion and studious engineer. The two had come to inspect the fortified gatehouse that was once Yol Grimnir. The road and gatehouse had been hastily destroyed to cover those retreating from the devastation. The Duwarden of the local garrison had been tasked with the restoration. Balion and Swaz marveled at the craftsmanship. As the first rays of the Hish crested the valley, Balion's attention was drawn to the mighty star drake, Tiburon, whose roar welcomed the light as it did every morning since he had taken the mantle of Champion of Pilgrim's Hollow. Balion also spotted the pale saurian Croxtetl, sharing in Tiburon's welcoming of the sun. The Seraphon under his command had made their home by the star drake, and were welcomed additions to the city. Balion and Swaz entered the area of the hollow known as Traveler's Rest, a residential area for those who have made the long journey. As they walked through the streets, Balion stopped and directed Swaz's gaze towards the Dryad as they left the glade in the town center.
Alariel's children had taken root here and managed the greenery of the area. Balyan smiled at the young Grot's wonder and motioned for them to move on. Noise from across the river drew their attention. Even this early, a pair of uruks were in a brawl with an ogre. A score of Grots circled the trio, taking bets. The Fulgurite Order so believed in the dream that was Amasya, they continued to welcome all, so long as their intentions were noble. Balyan and Swaz shared a laugh as they came to the central fortress. Sundrake Citadel had been razed where Azurhol and Izek Kulse once stood. Part fortress and part arcane tower, it was named after Tiburon's morning ritual. It was garrisoned by those who refused to abandon the hollowed necropolis, and those travelers who decided that this dream was worth fighting for. Balyan and Swaz walked through its main street, seeing soldiers going about their morning routine. Balyan's thoughts went to former Seneschal General von Helminger, and hoped she was well. The companions departed the citadel, and soon came upon Heroes' Haven. Once the great necropolis of Rahitmazar, the Fulgurite Order salvaged what they could and rebuilt the sepulchre. Upon completion, a monument was erected featuring the names of all those who made the ultimate sacrifice in both Amasya's reclamation and its unfortunate demise. Standing proudly atop is a statue of Angela Sunsoul, who lost her immortal life safeguarding the Defender's withdrawal. Standing at the entrance was a skeletal figure dressed in royal finery. Balyan saluted King Duststalker as he approached. Swaz idled nearby, studying the memorial as the two leaders spoke. The restless dead had become the nocturnal guardians of Pilgrim's Hollow so that the living may rest. Nodding, the two parted ways as the White King entered the necropolis. Balyan waited for Swaz to rejoin him as they continued their journey towards the Stormkeep. Grung Essek, supposed masterpiece of the Duardan god Grugni, was the only part of Amasya that was spared. Now the site of the Brightblade, the new home of the Fulgurite Order, and cementing their role as the stewards of Amasya. The Stormcast hoped to soon have the broken sluice gates working to better help travelers along the River. Balyan saw Lord Relictor Dawncaller standing at the entry gates. The rictus grin of his mask impassive darkened in the morning light.
Hail, Lord Stormmantle! Your timing is impeccable.
His tone was warm and mirthful.
A Kriegsrat is about to convene.
Balyan's step faltered slightly. A war council had been called. Where does the battle lead us this time? Balyan inquired. The answer froze him to the core.
Azir, lad. War has come to Sigmar's door.
The past no longer.
The boy's earliest memory was his mother's death. Her body glistened with sweat in the candlelight, racked by fever. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she frothed at the mouth as grandfather bestowed his gifts, her abdomen rupturing and blossoming open like some obscene flora. The metal ring of the hammer blow resounded through the halls of the Sigmar Abolum. The memory burnt away beneath the white-hot strike and was replaced by another. He remembered his father's face, brow furrowed with rage abated only by devout prayer. He remembered the march of boots and hooves as the city emptied for battle. He was too young to fight. He was left behind. He was raised by tutors, each one stern and uncompromising. Elves, cloaked in shadow, taught him how to fight, and when his ability for sorcery emerged, elves cloaked in light taught him how to harness it. White kings long dead instructed him on matters of rulership and undying faith, while scarred old Duardan mentored him on how to wage a war. Someday his father would return, dead or alive, and he would need to be ready. He lost his father's face in the heat of the hammer strike, but remembered the sweat on his body racked by fever. He returned neither dead or alive, but something worse. His body torn open by a pestilent blade. Despairing, the boy turned to his faith, trusting the undying king to save his father's life. His childhood withered and burned away on the anvil, lost among the sparks. He was a king and a priest, a warrior and a sorcerer. At his back was an army of the holy and devout. They stood before the Shyish Archway, shoulder to shoulder with the God King himself. There, his faith demanded that he quit the field, and though he wished nothing more than to avenge himself upon the slaves to darkness, he could not risk his father's life. The armies of Nagash left Sigmar's and his warriors to their fate. His youth was lost to Azir's wars of vengeance upon Shyish, and later the Dark God's conquest of it. His faith was sorely tested as years became decades and the hope of victory a distant memory. Too old to fight any longer, he despaired that he would never see his home again. In this hour of greatest need, his faith was rewarded, and nothing less than a Mortarch bestowed upon him the blood kiss of immortality. In that moment, he was remade, stronger than he'd ever been. He would spend the next 5 centuries repaying this debt. Hundreds of years burned away on the anvil like ashes in the wind. The name Eraziel slipped through his fingers and was forgotten. Instead, he was returned home. Once again, an army marched at his back, his reward for unyielding faith. He would finally be reunited with his father and prove himself a worthy heir. Something wore his father's flesh as a husk, and now, free of its bindings, it had no further use for the vampire that had released it. The boy did not lament as the hammer struck these memories, as the pain fell away too. Every despair, every betrayal, every failure, losing them was a mercy. For the first time, the boy recoiled from the hammer. He didn't want to forget this moment. He stood alone, his death certain, his defiance absolute. It was the only moment he'd ever become what he always meant to be. It was a better thing than he'd done his entire life. He didn't want to forget. He didn't want to forget. Clad in gleaming cerulean and white, their face hidden behind the stern features of their mask impassive, the Knight Incantor crossed the antechamber where a Knight Relictor stood, waiting to receive them. The Relictor offered the Incantor's stave, and for a moment both warriors' hands clasped its haft.
Who are you?
The Knight Relictor's hoarse voice rasped, the stave still in his grasp. My name is Atisa, the warrior replied, betraying no emotion. The Relictor respectfully inclined his head and surrendered the Incantor's weapon. I died. I was reforged. It is by Sigmar's will.
The hunter and the hunted. Bubbles rose from the murky depths, bursting in the stagnant air. The frothy mixture had an unsettling stench that lingered far too long. Beneath his long-brimmed hat, Heinricus Hellsbane glowered down at the foul swill as bits of some unidentifiable material gathered at the tankard's bottom. He was a long way from Azir and all its amenities, but a job needed to be done. He glanced over the tankard's rim, scanning the poorly lit pub another time. Grime-encrusted walls danced with muted firelight and strangely shaped shadows. Not much had changed since he had arrived. Mud-slathered locals came and went, filling themselves full of similarly repugnant liquids until they could hardly walk out the door. Each seemed to share a similar sentiment to the next, remarking on the hardships of their crop, unfortunate weather, or the encroaching cold of winter. Hellsbane had received a suspicious glance or two over the course of the evening, but none dared approach the cloaked stranger lurking in the corner. He was sure that news of his arrival had made it around the town. In fact, he was relying on it. Steepfield, or Bulyami, as its stubborn citizens insisted on calling it, was a place that held old secrets. Perhaps the kind that could explain the sudden appearance of an entire alien island in their beloved lake. Sudden movement from the far corner booth caught his eye. A cloaked Duardin slid from the bench as he tossed a few copper onto the table. He glanced around before brushing his grey beard and waddling out of the pub. The same one Hellsbane had tracked to this abysmal place over the past weeks. Reeking of foul magics, the witch hunter itched to put the Duardin down here and now, but he was only half the equation here. After several moments, a hooded local slipped from the same booth. This one moved almost silently, giving a nod to the barkeep and exiting the building. Hellsbane wasted no time, leaving the awful brew behind to molder. Cold air whipped through the swinging door as the elements forced their way into the humid pub. Outside, the world was frigid, and winter winds howled down the empty street. The witch hunter glanced right, then left, only glimpsing his quarry for a moment before he disappeared into a side street. Hellsbane moved as fast as lightning, turning the corner in pursuit. The alley led between the sagging houses that lined the street, the faintest bit of moonlight giving the suspect's location as he turned down the next throughway. Struggling to keep a safe distance, Hellsbane sprinted, his hand slipping under his coat to grip the holster there, just in case. He cut the turn to see the whole alley. Nothing. Disbelief struck him. Either they knew the town that well, or something bigger was happening here. Urgency drove Hellsbane out of the stunned moment. He dashed ahead, rounding another right corner and out into an open street. Puffs of crystallized breath hung in the air as Hellsbane breathed heavily. "What the?" he muttered under his freezing breath as he looked around. Without warning, another voice shattered the evening silence. "Late night, my fellow Azurite?" asked Father Tremaine, standing out front of the Temple of Sigmar. He was as aged and eroded as the temple he looked after. Its exterior was weathered and streaked with grime. Sickly roots tore at the facade as if the land itself refused to accept its presence. "Father, I apologize for the intrusion. Hellsbane shook off the ill feeling creeping up on him. "You seem troubled. Do come in. We've just finished evening service." The priest offered a hand towards the dimly lit, rather empty temple. "I was just looking for someone that just passed by. They were interested in my work." Hellsbane composed himself quickly, knowing well that it would be foolish to trust anyone, even a fellow Azurite. "I'm afraid the faithful may have carried your colleague off to the pub with them," Tremaine chuckled. Before Hellsbane could respond, a sharp thump of striking wood echoed within the temple. The priest nearly leapt out of his skin, spinning around to see the assailant. A shambling mass of cloth and mud shuddered through the doorway. "Oh, Madame Powler," the priest let out an audible sigh. "I thought you'd left with the rest." "The cold's getting to these old bones," Ma Powler replied as her ancient face looked up at the two. "Don't move like I used to." Ma Powler forced a grin, but the long creases etched into her face said otherwise. Her robes were stained with dirt and snowmelt, while only barely disguising her hunch. She leaned on the gnarled walking stick, its petrified wood curled upwards into a knot that grasped a dark chunk of mineral Hellsbane couldn't identify. "I will admit," the priest paused, "it was a surprise to see you, but not unwelcome at all. We hope to see you more." "Well, I was in town for some business." She shot Hellsbane a predatory glance. This time the crone's grin was genuine. "I just had to stop by." The sarcasm in her craggy voice was as thick as the frozen ground. Father Tremaine rolled his eyes in sore frustration before taking a step back in defeat. "I must close up for the night. I bid you both good night. May Sigmar guide you." The priest curtly stepped into his house and shut the doors. The muffled thumps of several locks being set punctuated his exit. Well, I ought to be getting home," Ma Prowler stated, turning to move up the road. "It's late, and you ought to, too. Only gonna get colder from here on." The crone laughed aloud and patted Hellsbane on his side twice before shuffling on her way, humming an unfamiliar tune. Hellsbane stood, rooted to the spot, watching her slowly disappear up the street and towards the frozen edges of town. The witch hunter quietly walked a meandering path to the inn he had decided to stay at for the night. As he walked, his fingers traced over the mysterious scrap of paper that had found its way into his coat pocket. Hellsbane slid silently through the door, past the sleeping innkeeper, and up to the room. The witch hunter peeked through the frosted window, seeing nothing save a lamplighter somberly working their way down the street. Years of training held him there by the window until the street was empty. He quietly doffed his boots, wet with snowmelt, and dropping a length of root, the same kind that pervaded the town. The scrap of paper was dirty and ragged, most likely torn from a local advertisement. Aged ink spelled out barely decipherable print, but what was important was inside. Hellsbane carefully unfolded it to reveal a message. The handwriting was poor, unpracticed, but delivered the ominous message regardless. The hair on Heinrichus Hellbane's neck stood tall as he read. "Outsider, ye tread on ancient ground. Winter grows deeper than ever, colder than old Bones himself. Ye do not know what comes, nor is the Lightning Lord prepared for it. Our roots go deeper than any, and this sacred land we will preserve. The Burning Isle is just the beginning. Choose your side wisely. May your roots guide ye proper. MP." The witch hunter stared at the note in stunned silence. Amongst the mouldering floorboards, a stray length of root twitched, shuddered, and reached its grabbing tendrils underneath the bare foot of Heinrichus Hellsbane. A bloody oasis!
A warm wind blows across the plains of the Scarland, fanning the flame of the inferno raging inside the Three Sisters. Its militia, responsible for quenching any fire that breaks out, lays dead on the roads winding around the massive outcrops on which the city is built. Soldiers of the Exfratensis go from house to house, taking all of value that is not too cumbersome and setting fire to the rest. Wild corpse ripper vultures are circling around in the sky above, eagerly waiting for their turn, while two Caradron ironclads fire their harpoons into one of the aqualiths floating within the city and pulling it away, its waters splashing down, quenching some of the flames. Marcus stood a couple yards away from the city, stoically watching the burning city before him, hands behind his back, the blazing heat reaching him even here. Marcus held mixed feelings for the spectacle happening before him. The fires reminded him of his former home, his family, and while he did not set the fire himself that time, a burning city still reminded him of that failure. On the other hand, the destruction of the flames showed the power he now held, and how he could hold the fate of a city in his hands if he put his mind to it. He liked that feeling. He liked it enough to take the unpleasant memories of his former home for granted, the price for wealth and power. Not too far away from him, his carts were filled up with the loot taken by his men. To the winner, the spoils, Marcus thought to himself, while in the corner of his eye he spotted several figures running into desert known as the Starfall Sands. Heavy bootsteps in the sands behind him, together with the smell of freshly baked bread, alerted Marcus to the presence of the Caradron Admiral.
"You let them run away, dear?"
The Admiral spoke up, gesturing to the people running away into the desert. Marcus shrugs in response.
Let them leave.
If they think their chances of survival are greater in the desert, who are we to dissuade them from such foolish notions? The Admiral shakes her head.
"You're a cruel man, Marcus."
Marcus responds only with his signature rakish smile, making the Admiral roll her eyes. He remained quiet for a minute between the two, while in the distance 3 audible thuds of iron-puncturing stone signals the seizure of the second aqualith by the frigates of the Caradron mercenaries. A content smile appears on Marcus's face. The troops of the Exfratensis were moving away from the burning city, wagons filled with loot in tow. In the sky, one of the ironclads detaches themselves from the first aqualith and turns around, moving back towards the city, setting course for the last aqualith. Your company is as efficient as always, Theodora.
Guaranteed delivery, dear. That's no joke. You want to continue with the next step?
The perishable, non-perishable, and needs to perish clause? Yes. Theodora waits for a moment.
Are you sure?
Marcus takes a deep breath, letting the magnitude of the decision settle for a few seconds. The client wished to set an example of what happens when they are refused, so an example we shall make. Proceed. Theodora turns around, nodding to her signaller, who proceeds to raise his flags. The signals were for the ironclad that had made its way to the last aqualith, who, after receiving the signals, turned so one of its broadsides was facing the aqualith. With a second set of flag motions, the ironclad opens fire on the aqualith. Its ammunition blows holes in the aqualith, from which fresh water begins to pour out, falling down on the burning city below. A second broadside disrupted the geomantic magic that holds the aqualith aloft, causing it to tilt sideways, slowly losing altitude. The water now rushes out of cisterns hidden in the rocks, turning the small pour of water into a torrent, crushing windmills, lifts, and bridges already damaged by the fire. A third set of flag motions signals the ironclad to move above the falling aqualith. The moment it gets there, it drops a load of bombs on top of the aqualith, severely damaging the metallith and severing the geomantic magic completely, causing the aqualith to free-fall down towards the city of Three Sisters. The impact was a spectacle, rock, water, and fire everywhere. followed by boiling hot steam and mud covering its streets. Satisfied, Marcus turns around and walks towards the rest of Exfratensis, followed closely by Theodora and her signaler. In the sky, the two remaining Aquilus were towed away. Theodora speaks up first. "Who needs two Aquilets?" Marcus thinks for a moment, then answers. "The client wanted just one at first, but the three sisters refused their offer." She shakes her head in disbelief. "What a bloody mess." Marcus just shrugs. "More like a bloody oasis."
The finale of Fleets.
Admiral Rainvok Grimbreaker surveyed his armada from the tallest tower of his black arc Suncrusher, appreciating the sleek wolf ships and wave runners that made up the majority of his forces, while casting a side-eye at the disgusting, smoke-belching dwarven cog haulers and ungainly human grand galleons. He'd be happy for their firepower and resilience in the coming days, when his crusade force reached their target, the Osiarch fortress city of Mirnax. They were ahead of schedule, the waters glittering azure from the cloudless skies, and formidable winds the Mercurial Guards gifted them their entire trip. Not that the Dwarden vessels cared for that, nor even Randavok's Black Ark. He chuckled and sneered as he felt it vibrating, knowing that the great mantis shrimp that bore Suncrusher aloft growled with anger and hunger. Akshi's hot seas provided little in the way of nutrients for the monster, and he liked it that way. It was easier to control a broken monster when you controlled when and how much it got fed. It's why Randavok chose the beast to build his fiefdom upon. Suncrusher growing into a veritable city like all other respectable Black Arcs. He also chose it for what it could do to any walls that thought to bar Randavok from the gold and glory he desired. Suncrusher rocked violently, Randavok's sea legs saving him from a tumble into the spiked oblivion of his own city. He cursed as he looked ahead and saw the seas turning choppy despite the calm weather. A sudden wave crested and overtook one of the small wolf ships scouting ahead, the ship vanishing with the wave like some parlor trick. He looked around and saw more and more tides rocking the ships of his armada, heard the crack of gunfire and the screams of the dying reach him ever so faintly at the top of Suncrusher. In one swift motion, he had a spyglass up to his eye, looking down at a cog hauler whose dwarven crew was blasting and chopping away at some oversized crabs that the tumultuous seas had deposited on their deck. Several dwarven shoveled coal in a desperate attempt to restart their engine, but the cog hauler belched its last as something cut the iron-hided ship nearly in two. Randavok spat curses to all the gods of sea, ocean, and spite as ever-growing waves bore down upon his ships. More and more of them, coming from all directions. A grand galleon broadsided one wave to no avail, everything, crew, masks, and rigging, disappearing from its decks as the wave crashed over it. Even Suncrusher wavered as the seas betrayed them. Thunder boomed within the seas as Suncrusher's beast opened fire. A massive nova of superheated water exploding everywhere in every direction from the blast. Randavok grinned as the seas calmed momentarily, his own beast clearly besting whatever nightmare tried to turn him into prey. Then, Randavok was thrown off his feet as Sun Crusher quaked. Seconds passed without abatement, the ancient admiral carefully picking himself up and bracing against his balcony's railing. Randavok's next curses drew the attention of darker powers than most would care to beckon, eyes locking onto the now Red Sea and one of his beast's mighty claws as it bobbed in the frothing water once, twice before sinking. "Make to land!" Randavok bellowed, gesturing towards the closest island. Signals were sent by flag, smoke, and magic, and every vessel in his fleet changed course sharply to race toward that island and salvation. Randavok raced down the stairs as Sun Crusher continued to shake itself apart, the Black Ark city not built to withstand this level of torment. Every time he failed, he skittered back to his feet with desperation instead of anything resembling elven grace. He fell only during the worst quakes, and he knew those could only be caused by something killing his beast, his fiefdom. "Keep it alive!" Randavok screamed as he rushed past his personal cabal of Giranite sorcerers, some of them already lying dead in their attempts to keep Sun Crusher and its beast from beyond Shaish's gates. By the time he emerged on Sun Crusher's main thoroughfare, or main deck, the sea behind them was dark with the lifeblood of his fiefdom and his armada. He rushed to the bow of Sun Crusher, seeing too few of his ships beached on the island just ahead of them, as his beast started to claw its way onto the island. One of its alien eye stalks sensed his presence, turning up to look at Randavok. "Don't you dare die!" Randavok screamed at the monstrosity he had broken for his own benefit. His voice broke as his words turned to pleading. It can't end like this!" The creature collapsed then, finally free of its servitude in death, and in doing so, spilled Randavok overboard. He landed on its head as it lay in final sleep, tumbling off its hitherto impenetrable carapace and landing roughly in the blood-soaked sand below. Rough hands helped him up, but Randavok shoved them away and screamed at the survivors assembled around them. "Which one of you forgot your tithe?" He grabbed a nearby dwarden by the beard, dragging him close. "Was it you? Did you think Uruk-Nal a myth?" As the dwarden shook his head, Randavok whirled on one of the inland desert barbarians recently assimilated into the cities of Sigmar and Akshi. "How about you? Have you even heard of who drags below? Or are you so illiterate I should call it crabnose?" Something nipped at his heel, and he kicked it before looking, seeing a crab go flying through the air to plop back into the rising water. Another crab emerged, then another. Crabs of different colors, shapes, and sizes began to crawl from the red, roiling surf, the only things connecting them being strange runic script covering their shells and the mad hunger seen in their clacking claws and writhing mandibles. What remained of his crusade force retreated a step, uttering prayers to Sigmar and their people's other gods. "It's too late for that," Randavok sighed, drawing his cutlasses. He injected what power he could into his voice as he pointed forward. "They are the enemy. Form up and prepare to repel assault. Save your guns for when the bigger ones show up." That one's man-sized," a human shouted. "They get bigger," Randavok said, spitting to the side. "A lot bigger." Even though he paid his dues, Ragnarok knew Krabnos' family would show him no mercy. His fleet was already lost, his crusades worth of men, weapons, and relics sent to wage an entire war against the Bone Reapers. But his fiefdom still stood, if a bit lopsided. Even if it couldn't prowl the seas ever again, it was still there, and it was still his. "You can't have it!" Ragnarok Grimbreaker screamed, dodging a massive claw and skewering the crazed crab's head. "This one is mine, Krabnos! This one is all mine!" But Ragnarok and his forces fell back, step by bloody step, as the crabs continued to come and the waters continued to rise. Cutlasses and bullets skipped off thick shells, while monstrous claws snipped and crushed, leaving only a red ruin of bodies in their wake. As the front lines moved up the blood-churned sands of the beach, smaller crabs swarmed the remains, pincers plucking rings, jewelry, and all that glittered before returning it to the Red Seas. Ragnarok's troops held as the ogre-sized crabs emerged and smashed through plate mail to pulp the man within. His troops balked as Carnosaur-sized crabs required their ship cannons to take down. By the time a crab arrived that could outcrush a maw crusher, his troops had pushed off and set sail once more, despite the crabs swarming their ships. Ragnarok cursed their cowardice and watched their ships scuttle and sink in the vain attempts to escape the fate of all who deny Krabnos his tithe. All the while, he fought off crabs as he danced his way back up his dead beast and finally hauled himself onto Sun Crusher's deck. Water splashed as he planted his feet, looking around to see privateers and civilians alike fighting off crabs that skittered over his flooding fiefdom's streets and buildings. Ragnarok looked upon his ruin with despair and screamed.
The Demon in Red. The ogre's hut lay at the end of a long, low gorge. Elsewhere, the hills and mountains rose like the jagged fangs, yet here, at the end of the valley, they had been ground down to broken tusks by time and the howling winds. Cutting back and forth across the rock-red slopes, the trail was wide and well-maintained. It would have almost have been welcoming, if not for the rows of pikes along its length and the grisly trophies they displayed. The heads of goblins, humans, and more stared down at the rider, mouths agape in silent warning. Some were ancient, desiccated things, but plenty were fresh enough to tell him that the ogre was at home. Armored scales, lacquered a deep and rich crimson, jangled softly with each padding step of the war-wolf. The valley wind was hot and dry, rippling the black silk robes the rider wore beneath the heavy lameller, and snapping at the twin banners at his back. A wide sash of the same black silk was tied at his waist, proudly displaying the same symbol that hung from the banner poles, a yellow, jagged sun. A tall helm, crimson as the rest of his armor, topped the figure, a wolf tail hanging from its tip and a snarling, bestial mask covering his face. The rider spurred his wolf to a trot, moving swiftly through this forest of blank, staring faces. The casual cruelty of the ogre had little impact on the rider, but his time was growing short, and night would fall quickly in the mountains. He could see smoke ahead now, twin columns rising above the foothills, black and greasy. The rider pulled up on the reins, slowing the wolf as it passed between the final row of pikes. Just ahead, a final warning lay on the path. a massive axe set upright, its steel head buried deep into a boulder. The rider was tall and broad for his kind, but he knew he could not hope to lift that axe, let alone drive it deep into solid stone. Strips of cloth hung from the axe's handle, whipping about in the valley wind. Tattered banners, dozens of them, showed the colors of tribes and kingdoms come and gone. The rider saw one bearing the same sun that adorned his own back, and with steel in his gaze spurred the wolf down into the valley. The ogre's hut was low and wide, squatting like a malicious toad at the end of the gorge. Twin lines of black smoke rose from within, and this close the rider could smell the stench of burning flesh. The doorway was dark, but he could sense movement within. The rider held his crescent-bladed Jumanji lance high above his head, the dark blue iron catching the fading sun's light in dazzling fire and blazing crimson. "Ogre, I am Sirin Kulan, called the Crimson Demon, and chief of the Seven Spears of Otsuga. I come with words from the Shogun." There was movement within the darkened doorway, the sound of metal scraping against stone, and then the figure emerged. Though the door was several times the rider's size, the massive ogre still had to squeeze its way through. A dusty red robe covered the creature's body, while segmented iron plates hung from its shoulders and a tiger skin at its waist. Sharp, tusk-like teeth sprouted from its mouth as though its jaw could not hold them, and a pair of tall, ribbed horns crowned its monstrous head. A heavy octagonal steel war club rested easily on his shoulder. Its voice, when it came, was pitched so low that it sent vibrations running down the rider's spine.
"What do you want, Hobgoblin?"
The club rolled easily off the ogre's shoulder, and he planted it on the ground, both hands resting on the top of its pommel. "The Shogun demands your supplication. The old emperor is dying, and with it the empire. A new glorious dawn awaits. Submit to the Shogun now, and you shall share in that glory." The ogre lifted the club a hand's breadth from the ground, then stamped it down again. A sharp crack sounded by the rider's side, and he felt the lance shatter in his hand. The wolf beneath him leapt in sudden alarm, and the rider was thrown from the saddle onto the red, dusty ground. He looked up, but the ogre had not moved. "How dare you, shaman! Harm me, and the Shogun will show you no mercy. You shall be obliterated. Your entire people shall be wiped from this realm." He reached for the sword tucked into his silk sash, but as his fingers closed over the handle, he felt a searing pain. With a cry, he flung the sword from his side. Where it landed, he could see the metal glowing a dull red. The ogre stood as still as a statue, but movement shimmered around it. Flickering flames of deep blood red alit around its eyes, and the air beside it wavered like a heat mirage before spilling its overripe fruit. From gaps and reality that bled blood-red flames of their own, 3 canine creatures emerged. Black, bristly hair sprung from red and scaly shoulders, and large spiked frills adorned their brass-collared necks. Blood-flecked muzzles curled around monstrous teeth in vicious snarls. The wolf, which had been standing over its fallen master, gave a soft whine and then turned and looked off into the hills.
The fallen hobgoblin looked up at the ogre, and the three creatures snarled at its side and saw no mercy in any of them. "Demon," he began, with as much venom as he could muster. But the ogre stamped the end of his club on the ground again. As one, the beast's pounce. There was a short scream, then a long, prolonged, and wet sound of the body being torn apart. The ogre did not stay to watch. Crouching, he turned back to his hut and descended into the gloom. The caves below ran for miles, deep beneath the earth, deep into darkness. Let the shogun plan his war. His own masters waited below in shadow and flame.
Notes from an unseasonable winter.
Ice coats Lastia's harbor in a shifting maze of floes. They scrape along the arid scholar's sides, swirling into barely available space as the carrack crawls into the small bay. Winter still had its jaws locked firmly around the Axian town, a winter that should have passed months ago and never threatened to freeze the arbor over. "This," spoke the vessel's boatswain, "is unnatural even for a place in the realm, Staff." The green-clad figure beside him only nodded as he pulled his coat tighter against the weather. Leaning over the balustrade of the ship, Davidius Mappenborough winced as a jagged length of ice the size of a carcadrak caressed the hull. "The ship's going to need breaching, Tom. This place hasn't even heard of a dry dock." Tom, the boatswain, grunted in agreement. "Aye, you'll have to schlep it upstream to the source over land while we get her patched up again." As the battered vessel finally nosed her prow up next to the nearest jetty, a party of awkwardly wrapped figures waddled along to meet the lowered gangplanks. As his boots hit the boards, Davidius could make them out well enough to realize they were swaddled in curtains and drapes. Even rugs had been repurposed to fend off a cold unseen in Axian jungle.
"You Sir Dabindas, then, lad? Must be no other boat since the ice started."
A hand emerged from a particularly fine pile of velvet to grasp Davidius's hand.
"Come on, the stockyard's no place to natter. Tallykeep has the largest fireplace."
The bevelveted figure turned swiftly, almost forgetting to drop the scholar's hand, and began to stump back down the jetty. The light thrown off by the fire danced through a ripple of greens, reds, and pinks, the distinctive flames of Axian wire palm's metal-infused wood.
"When we sent word to Seeds, to be perfectly honest, I did not expect a response, let alone the head of the biologist to come in person. Forgive me, Sir Davidius, and for my error outside as well. But why have you come? Not some meteorologist or arcanist?"
Lady Havil von Mest, now divested of her velvets, sat on the side nearest the formerly decorative fireplace. "For 2 reasons, Lady von Mest. Firstly, collegiate politics. No doubt you are familiar with such things. And secondly, it is most likely that this occurrence is related to other disturbances in the realm of fire, related to matters under my own purview, and thus, so it held, falls also under me." Davidius's face briefly contorted in a grimace before he stood to cross the room to rummage briefly in his drying coat. Returning, he spread a map over the table, weighting its corners with candlesticks and glasses. "Observe. Our reports cover these areas outlined in blue. And you see," she laced her fingers and narrowed her eyes across the table, "this is not the work of the Ratmen." He shrugged back at her. "It is our current prevailing theorem. Personally, I have my own suspicions, which," he held a hand up to forestall the question forming on her lips, "I shall not be sharing at this time. Suffice it to say that in correlation with other reports, my lady, we conclude that the epicenter of this phenomenon lies much further upstream than your domains." Lady Havil let her shoulders slump back onto her chair. "So you're not staying?" Davidius shook his head. "We cannot aid you in this. Only seek to understand, and in understanding, explain. Perhaps then a solution may present. I have referred your crisis to the Collegiate Arcana, and perhaps more usefully, to the Logistica Department of Hammerhall Akshi. The mages might thaw your harbor in time. Hammerhall, at least, will send you coats. It had been 3 days since they had left Lastia, and the approximate comforts of reclaimed civilization. Davidius was beginning to think that perhaps they had never been warm. Even through his Mournfang hide gloves and heavy coat, the cold had begun to seep into his very bones. Vaston and Galam felt similar. It was the main topic the knights discussed as they slept in full gear, huddled into a single tent for warmth. The cold, but more importantly, the source of the cold. Galam still held to the collegiate orthodoxy that the appearance of winter in subtropical Akshi must relate to the resurgent activities of the Skaven.
It's clear, he said, as Dr. Barrion suggests, the increased prevalence of gnawholes must be venting the heat, or else allowing the frigid climes of Edgewood, Giran, or Ugu to seep in and induce winter.
Vaston, at least, had begun to see sense. The last nail in the coffin of meteorological gnawhole cooling, as a theory, came in the form of gnashing jaws and slashing teeth in the foothills of Ignoth's furnace.
Kurnoth's bark! Was that a damned yeti?
Vashton bellowed, as a mound of shaggy white fur bundled one of the porters into a snowdrift. But none of the party had time to respond. A handful of pistol shots rang out, and the scent of powder smoke mingled with the frost-laden air. 4 frost sabers died as the pack closed on the remaining Knights Skolast and their entourage. With no time to reload, the ambush became a dance of steel and ivory partially obscured to all combatants by a swirling cloud of snow thrown skyward by rapid footwork and lunging frost sabers.
This cannot be an Everwinter, Galam shook his head, but it must be. Usually they spread for a few miles around the Beastclaw tribe at the most, Vaston countered. But we have been experiencing this for leagues since downstream of Lastia. We would have encountered the Ma tribe it is following by now, but only these trailers. Observe the Frost Sabers, man. Unbound, Davidius interjected. These are wild, not broken by a tribe, rare as basilisk teeth. Whatever this is following, it is no tribe of ogres. The knights trudged onwards in debate until their last surviving guide intervened to inform them. Here we are, my lords. The Ashfall Delta. What's left of it, at least.
Davidius stood on the bank line next to 2 dumbfounded Knights Scholastica.
That,
he said grimly to their questions, is the Cataractus.
Not all things die.
Everything was cold. The man felt as if he was trying to open his eyes through thick liquid, and when he finally opened them, he found nothing. Maybe he shouldn't have bothered at all. The frigid thickness coached the man as he tried to move around. His body was not responding as it should. There was no smell. His fingers provided him no texture. There was nothing underfoot, but neither was there anywhere for him to fall. The nothing was unending. The man became distraught as he drifted forward, at least forward from where he had been before. He had a job to do, a duty to fulfill, but who had given it to him? He couldn't remember. Time ticked by. Days turned into weeks as the man contemplated his duty. He had been the only thing he had, and that might have been true for his life, too. That's right. He had been a tool. The duty had been bestowed upon him by his wielder. There was a sense of rightness there, a sense of pride. He had served the best of the best, he whose cause was nothing but righteous, and the man was honored by serving as his tool. He had served Sigmar. Yes, Sigmar had asked him to go to a dark place. There was frigid water, thick and viscous, much like the darkness in which he now drifted. He had been searching for something ancient, rumored to have returned.
Do you remember Lake Bacal?
The man let out a scream at the voice tickling his ear. No sound came out. The man had no true mouth with which to do so. The speaker drifted into view. There was not much of it left. Half of a skull, a fractured collarbone, a spine broken off halfway down, 3 finger bones. They were arranged as close to where they might have been in life, which was not saying much.
I remember Lake Bacal, thought the man. That was the name of where I was sent. I went to make a report. I went to serve as Sigmar's eyes.
What was your name, O false king's eyes?
The man considered the question. After several minutes, he shook his head blankly.
I know your name,
the speaker continued, smug.
Han Shenzong. Do you remember what you did, Lord Aquila Shinzong?
The nothingness gave way to ice and snowy banks, and the man, Han Shenzong, he remembered, was in armor. Gold armor, tarnished with ichor so black the light seemed to absorb straight into it. A smell of iron and rot broke days, perhaps weeks of nothingness to flood his senses, and God's Han knew the smell of his own collapsing body when he smelled it. He hadn't returned to High Sigmaron. He remained on the banks of Lake Bacal, imprisoned in his own decay. Hatred seized Han Shenzong. Had Sigmar lied to him? His arms swung out at the speaker, only to find that there was instead a brightly armored Stormcast in front of him, and Han's Icarus sword punctured through 2 plates and into that living flesh. He could feel the malignant spread, a hateful gift for his former ally.
I'm just trying to help you!
The Stormcast cried out before their grand hammer smashed through Han and fractured his consciousness back into smithereens. He was once again left in the dark.
I'm dead. I killed my own.
He felt sick, even without a stomach to churn.
I killed many of my own. I tried to kill everything and anything. Everyone.
Everyone wishes to kill deep down. Everyone wishes for that dominance over the order of life. The dead, after all, are much more compliant.
No,
Han trailed off, but now he wasn't so sure.
Who are you?
The remains of the speaker drifted back into view. A skull chipped a little more with the effort of conversing.
I was once named Bash.
You. We fought. You were Mithridates Bash, imprisoned by Lake Bacal. I killed you and ended your wicked schemes. You were an enemy of the people.
Bash laughed until a crack formed down the arch of his loose cranium.
You certainly tried. And you were but a pawn in my games, once as well.
Souls or flesh, we are sworn foe.
We are one now, Han Shinzong. Hadn't you noticed?
The man went silent in the roiling darkness. Not that he had been making noise. The bones that had been Besh flickered and vanished, yet the priest-king's voice remained.
What is death when our essences remain? What are we when everything that was us is swirled into one and poured into an ocean of others?
More deaths scattered the darkness behind Han Shinzong eyes. Skinks blown apart into black Icarus puddles, stormcast melting into their armor, plague bearers' bodies breaking apart into ichor already so tenuously connected by rotten flesh. Besh's voice was cold.
We are nothing. We are everything. And never again can we find the release of death. I gave up looking for an end to this long ago, Han Shinzong.
Human citizens reached out to hold one another and melded together into pillars of black bile. Uliks were dragged down into the water and sizzled apart into slop. Han Shinzong felt the death of each and every one of them, as if he had been the one who had died.
Make it stop, Han whimpered. Take heart, little lordling.
Besh's voice grew faint.
Whatever we are becoming, whatever this new metamorphosis is, one day we will surely understand our new nature.
Make it stop! Han's mind crescendoed into a roar, and all the other voices in the blackness screamed with him. Make it stop! Make it stop! Sigmar, God, make it stop! But there was no one to help him, as the weeks turned into years, and the years turned into centuries, and the centuries lost all meaning.
The 13th night. The bells rang out over the hollowed skies. Once, this had been a sacred temple, a place of comfort and joy for the people of the plains. The silvered bells had rung loud and clear, their laughter the herald of markets and festival days, calling the joyous to gather and the faithful to worship. No longer. Since the hour of ruin, when the earth of the great Parch rent itself apart in gales of fury and warp fire, everything that made the place sacred had been ripped away. Gone were the bustle and cry of the market, replaced by the raucous shrieks of carrion birds at work. Gone were the gentle paeans of the choir and the eager steps of the faithful called to service, replaced by the scraping slap of clawed, scabrous feet on the stone. Gone were the sweet, silvered words of the bells above, for though they still rang out, they had been twisted as all else in this land had been. Warped and corroded, they called in maddening, unrelenting clamor, a brazen monotone from leaden throats choked with rust. Their calls lifted to the air and joined the thousand others ringing above the emergent Blight City. Within the ruined temple, the Skaven planned. A great table had been hauled forth, and around it the masters of this corner of the Parch schemed. They had to shout to be heard above the clamor. Skaven slaves, bedecked in every color of brown and with heads held low to avoid detection, pushed and milled about the corners of the chamber, stamping and biting and clawing to be the first to cater to the master's whims. Towering storm vermin, their armor clanking with each movement, lounged against desecrated shrines, taking swipes at passing slaves with their razor-lashed tails. Warlord clan generals beat their mailed hands on armored chests or thumped upon the table itself to get attention, voicing loudly their support or disdain for the order of business. Warp-lock engineers giggled madly at the hum and crack of green lightning crawling across their arms and lashing into the air. Eshin assassins perched in the shadows above, silent but for lashing of their tails on the wooden rafters to show their support or annoyance. Above it all shouted the Grey Seers, a trio of them at the head of the table. They called the business of the council, issuing orders to the warlords and directing the engineers, basking the praise of those their orders favored, or calling down dire threats on any who dissented from their command. It was the will of Blight City, the promise of power and influence for submission, and the threat of pain and penance for resistance. The three of them sitting in the seat of the great horned rat and speaking in his name. Few noticed the new entrants pushing themselves into the chamber, or paid much care to look into the heavy, rotting robes of the plague priests as they spread themselves out around the table. A storm vermin laughed cruelly to himself as he caught the neck of a nearby Skaven slave who had been refilling a large basin, forcing the smaller rat's head beneath the faintly green glowing liquid. The laugh was cut short as the edge of a long blade whirred through the air and came up a hair's breadth from his chin. Staring down its gleaming length, the storm vermin saw the tattered green cloak of a plague priest, and beneath it the gleam of plated armor. Then the figure was moving forwards, sword held steady, and the guard was forced to step back with it or be skewered. As he released the neck of the slave, the smaller rat burst up out of the warpstone wine, coughing and sputtering. And for just a moment, the storm vermin saw the cloaked figure's focus shift. Leaping backwards, he prepared to let out a great bellow of alarm. But before he could, a heavy steel pommel smashed into the back of his head. The storm vermin crumpled to the ground, his armor clattering, as the second swordsman behind him let his cloak fall from his plated steel shoulders. Few heard the sound of the guard collapsing, but the wave of fear musk spread like wildfire throughout the room. Around the table, a ring of figures cast their robes aside to reveal armored Skaven forms. Slaves shrieked, adding their own note of terror to the din and flooding the air with the scent of fear. They scrambled over each other to flee the chamber, trampling and clawing in a fit of terror, and became a stream of bodies against which the storm vermin guard struggled to fight through. Where they did, the armored knights struck swift and sure with silvered greatswords, severing halberds and flashing arcs. The interlopers struck to disarm or incapacitate where they could, taking hands and heads only when pressed. At the high table, the knights moved quickly, casting attendants aside and trapping the council against the heavy wooden board. One of the warlords was dead, his warp-lock pistol having blown a hole through the first knight to approach before twin greatswords pierced through his chest and pinned him to the table like a butterfly. The others were pressed to the ground or stood with arms raised, blades at their throats. The arch-warlock had not moved at all, only watching and giggling as the council dissolved into uproar, warp lightning cracking from eye to eye. The assassins had vanished. Only the Grey Seers fought on, swinging sword and staff in a frightful dervish. Where they struck, wood and stone and armored Skaven alike burst in sorcerous ruin. Here, however, the knights fighting them held nothing back. Silver swords leapt like fire, raining down killing blows and sending the sorcerers scrabbling back in desperation. They chanted as they fought, hymnals to the great horned rat. And where those black words scarred the air, the seer's spells faltered and failed them. One sorcerer stumbled. His heel caught on the body of a trampled slave.
and in an instant 3 blades struck down through heart and bone. The second Grey Seer leapt forward in a flash of darkness, driving his runic sword deep into the chest of the knight before him, only to see plated hands clamp down upon his wrist in a death grip. He struggled for a moment, then his head was whisked away in a silver flash by the dying knight's partner. The final seer fought on, alone in a ring of steel. He held his staff up, gathering what power he could to form a crackling green aura, warding off the striking blades. Silver flashed down again and again, hammering, ringing like the shades of the stricken bells above, until with a flash the seer's staff splintered and the ward collapsed. "Stop! Enough!" he cried as he fell, tossing his blade from his hands. "I surrender!" The ring of Skaven around him paused, their blades held ready, but took a half step back. A few looked across the room, and the seer followed their gaze to a knight with a pair of branching horns rising from his helmet. His eyes met the twin pit of blackness in the Skaven's helm, and he felt them swallow him, pin him to the floor. "Fine. I accept your surrender, Seer Thing." The voice rang hollowly inside the plate helm. "Let him stand rise." The knights around him parted, giving way and moving back to stand in a circle around the council table, though the seer heard one spit out "coward" beneath his breath. He rose unsteadily, unable to believe that they had simply let him live. The horned knight lifted his helmet, and the seer let out a surprised gasp. Blasphemous bile welled up within him when he saw the knight's horns were not part of his helmet, but rose from his skull. "I am Richter Blackfur, Grey Knight of the Ascension Court," the knight said to the room at large, walking towards the center. Stride in stride, grey fire curled up around his hand, climbing in a slow crawl like a parchment burning in reverse. As it rose, it revealed a chalice of black gold and green warpstone, shining in unholy light. "I have come to offer you the chance of ascension." "Ascension!" The ring of knights around the table spoke in unison, their voices metal and harsh beneath their helms, but joined in shared purpose. Richter knelt by the knight run through on the seer's runic blade, tipping the lip of the chalice to the dying Skaven's lips. He watched him drink the dark waters within, then pulled the sword free. Black smoke curled darkly around the blade and the wound, but Richter splashed more of the chalice's liquid across it. Steam hissed angrily, black blood mingling with green, and the knight tensed in sudden pain, but stayed silent. Richter laid his head back down and made again towards the table. "The chalice of the horned rat brings life to the faithful, to the true, to those who feel that we are meant for more." He walked carefully around the table, studying the warlords and their underlings, the storm vermin and the slaves. "Those who lie deceive us, keep us down, keep us fighting each other instead of our enemies, who take power in the great horned rat's name." He looked pointedly at the Grey Seer. "They take from us what he has promised." He stopped beside a stricken clan rat, cradling a broken arm. "If your faith is true, your devotion to the horned rat all complete, we offer the strength to claim all that we were meant for." He looked into the clan rat's eyes for a long moment, the chalice held between them. Then the smaller Skaven broke and turned away. "For those with the will,
We offer ascension.
Ascension!
Richter turned to one of the storm vermin. He had not gone down without a fight, and was bleeding heavily from a deep wound in his side and a severed forearm. They locked eyes for a long moment, and the storm vermin pulled himself up to his knees. Is your faith complete? Is your loyalty to the horned rat and the promise of ascension?
Ascension!
The storm vermin could not speak, but held the knight's eyes as Richter pressed the chalice to his lips. Warp light shone in his eyes, crackled from his wounds, and the storm vermin staggered to his feet.
This is blasphemy!
The last sorcerer cried, eyes wide with shock and rage. He shot out a hand, the pure warpstone badge of the Graziers grasped within, crackling with power. Magic crawled across its surface, and with a shout of fury the seer shattered the icon. Warpstone shards bit deep into the flesh of his hand, seething and spitting with power as they pierced the skin and seeped into his blood. The nearest knights tried to react, but they were too slow. A massive burst of warp lightning tore forth from the sorcerer, screeching across the chamber. It shattered the council table, vaporizing the warlock where he sat, and roared straight at the horned knight. Richter did not move. The warp lightning poured over and around him, a boulder in a stream of light. Warpstone runes glowed fiercely on the grey plate of his armor. Where it rolled from him, the lightning shattered and burned into the far wall, tearing great flaming chunks from the ruined temple. A bust of Sigmar on a forgotten mantle melted into a brief ray of gold. Stray lightning fell in waves into the ruins of the part beyond. Then it stopped. The sorcerer panted and fell to a knee. His hand was scorched and blackened, and blood leaked from his eyes. Richter stood where he had been, chalice in hand. The runes on his armor shone green, then faded black into the dull grey plate.
How?
The seer asked in a broken voice. The great horned rat looks after his own, usurper. He was walking now, across the chamber towards the fallen sorcerer. That is the power of ascension, of true faith, of what your parasitic order took from us.
I serve the great horned rat, blasphemer!
The seer managed in a raw, cracked voice.
We have always ever served him. You stole his power somehow.
He flinched as Richter stopped before him, towering over him, yet looked up in surprise to see the chalice being offered to him. Then drink, and take this power for yourself. The seer looked up, eyes narrowed in suspicion, then snatched the chalice from the knight's unresisting hands. He held it at arm's length at first, waiting to see if it would harm him. But where the liquid within spilled over the chalice's rim and onto his blackened hand, he felt the pain flow away and strength return. Greedily, the seer gulped at the liquid within. It spilled over his muzzle and ran down his chest. Warp light played across his limbs. He could feel it running through his body like a sprinkle of light rain at the same time as a bolt of fiery strength. He felt whole, strong, powerful, like he had never felt before. The warpstone he had absorbed from the amulet was nothing compared to this. He felt he could level mountains, tear the realms apart a second time with only his hands. He looked down at his blackened arm and saw it rebuilding itself before his eyes. New flesh, strong and firm, replaced the blackened bones, and new white fur sprouted along its length. He watched its fingers grow long and strong, claws like talons sprouting.
The muscles grew and spun, twisting along his arm, and suddenly pain shot through the euphoria that surrounded him. Ropey muscles twisting across his arm, his back, and then he felt the bones beneath snap under the pressure, grinding together as they reformed and reknitted together. His flesh split as bony spines grew through his flesh, sawing through skin and tendon to burst free. He tried to scream, but his mouth would not work. Jaws twisting, teeth and fangs becoming a tangled mass of sharpened tusks. He stumbled forward on legs that broke beneath racking form. "Brother Quoke!" The knight beside what was the seer stepped forward, and in one swift flash of silver severed the thing's head. He knelt and retrieved the fallen chalice. Already, the body was breaking apart into pools of stinking, blackish-green slime that burned the stone floors beneath it. "Remember this," Richter said, looking to his knights and the room at large. "Ambition, greed want, power without purpose is what he worshipped. It is why we shall win. For though they are many, they are many alone. We are few, but few united under purpose, under the great horned rat. That is the path to ascension."
Ascension!